I hope that's close enough to an answer. For, all right. Yes?
I have a question about conductive versus convective heat.
Temperature. Get yourself usually something like 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius above your charge temperature, and then idle there for a solid 20 minutes, maybe more in colder weather, and then come down somewhere just above charge for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then you want to enact a fake between batch protocol. In other words, pretend you just roasted a batch. Turn off the gas, bottom at your bottoming temperature, come back up and charge. Now you've sort of mimicked, hopefully if everything went well, that between batch protocol kind of helped you zero in on your thermal energy just a tad more. This works really well. You might have to modify it a little bit. You might need to go 50 Fahrenheit overcharge or 30, whatever. But this is better than 99% of what I see with new clients. Like and everyone adapts this reasonably well. And really, the only way to tell if it's working is if your first batch of the day looks the same as your 10th batch of the day. So I know you might do decaf or a small batch, whatever your first batch. But if you have the guts to put one of your, full-size batches of say whatever you roast frequently later in the day, like put it in first and see if your usual gas settings give you exactly the same curve. Like that's the test of your warm-up protocol.
Do you recommend leaving the drum door open in between batches to?
Only long enough to dispense the beans, really.
Really?
Yeah, because look, you do suck in a little cold air that way, but you also are kind of fooling yourself a little bit in terms of like the probe reading like goes haywire, right? Like it just drops tremendously, but the probe is out of the drum. And then when you close the door, there's a lot of equalizing that goes on, right? It's like now there's a lot of heat that has to kind of shift and kind of spread out evenly. Like I think it's okay to leave the door open a little bit longer, but it's not. Maybe it'll save you 15, 20 seconds or something like that. Like you still need time to stabilize and to be positive that the temperature bottom is consistent.
Well, in my experience, if I close the drum door, it heats up and it will take.
You have the new Diedrich, don't you?
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so those heat exchange panels are the cause of your problem.
Yeah.
So basically, those are trapping so much heat, it's nearly impossible to cool the machine between batches. You could literally turn the gas off, keep the door closed, go have lunch, come back, and your bean probe will probably still be reading near charge temperature, right?
Yeah.
So your choices are, at the extreme, one option is rip out the heat exchange panels, because I think they're a mistake, to be honest. The machine was easier to manage before those existed. They do stabilize the machine a lot, but they also prevent you from controlling it. It's a little bit like if you have one of those massive cast iron pans at home. Like you can cook with those, but once they get a little too hot or something, like it's a problem, right? Like there's less flexibility, there's less controllability there than with say like a really well balanced steel all clad pan or something like that. So you do have a problem where your machine is going to trap heat like crazy. So you might shut off the gas. You might accept a different type of between batch protocol. You might always use the soak. In other words, keep the gas off or very low for the first minute, maybe even 2 minutes of a roast. All of these things is a way to try to suck some heat out of the machine because your machine just gets hot and stays hot. So sorry about that. It's some machines, they may be able to roast some good coffee, but they may make it very difficult to get there, or they may make consistency difficult. Like some machines' designs are just like, there's trade-offs. Like the Diedrich's thermal stability is great, but then being able to control it and cool off between batches is a nightmare. So, yeah. Okay. Between batch protocol, almost everybody should be using something like this one, where you basically bottom, say something like 40 degrees, maybe not always 40 degrees, sometimes 20, 30, 40, depends on the machine, below your charge temperature, and then you come back up. We're talking about, I should change this, more like 2 to 3 minutes to get to the bottom, and then maybe a minute and a half to go back up. You don't want to go too fast, because you could conceivably go really fast down and then back up, but it's really easy to change the air temperature that's affecting the probe, but the metal temperature is moving much more slowly. So you might as well move at a modest speed so that you are a little bit more accurate in terms of what the metal's doing. If you have a machine that is basically kind of impossible to cool off, like yours, or like a 120 kilo probe out or something like that, you could conceivably just keep the machine relatively hot between batches. It's not optimal because the drum is going to be hotter, and that might add a little bit more conductive heat transfer, but it's realistic in terms of being consistent and not having to wait 20 minutes between batches. So, yes?
Is there a preference when you charge if you're coming up through your temp or down through your temp?
I'm not terribly concerned. I care more about do the same thing every time.
Okay.
If basically if you do the same thing every time and your curves trace like this every time, then you've succeeded. I'm happy, right? So this is 15 roasts in a row, right? And this guy, I swear, this I could pull this off of his crop store any day. Like this is not an exception. Like he only does one batch size. He only roasts kind of like light to medium, and he's really mastered the between batch protocol, and his curves just, they go in lockstep from the first batch of the day. And he follows all the things we just talked about. So, does this mean your coffee's going to taste great? Not necessarily. But if you don't have consistency like this, all the things you do for quality are going to end up, having kind of random results, right? So this to me is like the foundation, which is why I talked about one batch size, one between batch protocol, one charge temperature as the key to making it so much easier to have predictable, consistent roasts.
And is that the same bean at the same moisture level?
Yep. Yep.
So what if you don't have the same bean at the same moisture level?
Oh, so I mean the curves will look different, but if you roast the same Ethiopian 5 times, it should look like this. And if you roast the same Colombian 5, So I'm not saying the Colombian and Ethiopian both look like this. No. That would be interesting, but no. Okay, so let's take a break for 10 minutes. If you want to grab some water, use the restroom, whatnot. Just be careful to not bump the tripod if you don't mind, and we'll regroup here. Let's see if we can see the battery.
55?
I think we'll make it.
Okay. I think this is a little, because the charger was there, it's a little down, but it's not cutting anything off, I don't think.
No, I think it's okay. I think I can tilt it slightly.
Sure.
It's too much. Okay, so be it.
I think it's just because it had this behind it earlier that was like making it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it has to touch it to charge it.
Because you have to have that.
Yeah. You guys don't have one of those docks that you put the phone in, like when you're playing music, and to keep it charging or anything like that, do you?
No.
You know what the thing I mean?
Yeah.
It's like a little rectangular box that's just like,
Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
I almost went to the Apple store today to buy one because I was worried about exactly that, and then I figured this wireless charger would work. I just didn't think it would overheat it. But let's.
You want to just do it while we're on break?
Yeah. I think we can leave the phone as is. Let's see. I don't know.
Connect it to the front.
Hang on a sec. Okay. No, it's not going to work. Okay. Okay, I'll just leave it.
Okay.
I'll hope for the best. Thank you, Cam. This is awesome.
If it starts to die, do you want me to just take it out and put it behind it real quick and put it back while we're live?
No. Yes, but I'm thinking
Cut the video.
I might give Duffy my Facebook login, and then if it dies, I'm just going to put his phone in place of mine.
Okay.
And start a new video. I might potentially take you up on your offer.
Okay.
I might give you my Facebook login. I don't care. I never use Facebook anyway.
Right.
And then this has 56% battery. It should be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Just in case it looks like it's dying, we might put your phone. But the thing is, you have to be on my Facebook for it to work.
I gotcha. And you'd rather do it live versus just shoot B-roll and have that footage to then
I mean, yeah, because right now there's like 200 people watching it live.
Yeah,
So actually, you know
okay.
what? I'm just going to make you an admin. I don't even have to give you my. I think that'll.
Yeah.
I think being an admin will allow you to.
we can just swap it out.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. And so
Yeah, it's really that's funny.
I've talked to Elliot about that too. It's like roasting. It's gonna be fun, they said. It'll be a bunch of roasting.
You gotta just like, it's real discipline.
Yeah.
You know, in order to do it.
It's one of the reasons why I like Josh and be involved in the roasting. Like, dude, you're too flat by the seat of your pants.
Okay. You should be an admin now.
Great, just accept it.
So if you go to the group, I'm curious if you go to the. So you see how it says live.
Live.
So These are the, okay, so don't do it now. But if you had to do it, that's
Boom,
that's
boom,
how you do
boom.
it. Yeah.
Switch it up.
So, I'm so glad you came.
Oh, thank you so much. I wrote my book so you can sign it at the end.
Okay.
Please, thank
Okay.
you. Yeah, that'd be like super special for me. Thanks for letting me be here.
Sure.
I think with the between batch protocol, I think that's a struggle that we have right now.
I think I tried to convince Matthew. He likes to do it more on time relative to temperature, but I tried to tell him no, like do it by temperature, but he doesn't believe me.
I
So-
tried that on Friday, like tried to lower my temperature, and that helped me so much.
Yeah, it's hard to get him to change sometimes.
My rows were like way more consistent on Friday. I was like,
Good.
what? So
Yeah.
it took me longer. I get up like really late, but I
Uh-huh.
was like, but my rows were like really consistent.
Good. Good.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you so much. It's interesting. That was like the best advice I heard in like years.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
May I bring up something before I forget?
Of course.
I know it's a great time, but so we have an issue with a mill, 15 kilo mill.
Mm-hmm.
We have a really tall stack. And I talked to them about it, and they said it should be fine.
They think everything's fine.
I know, right? What happens, like when we drop a batch, turn the cooling fan on, the temp in the drum goes through the roof, so we can't do a normal between batch protocol.
Oh, you're merging your
So it-
chimney.
Yeah, there's not
That's
two
why.
separate.
That's why. So, do you dampen down the cooling fin duct? There should be a damper on it.
Okay,
If there's not, you should add one because that'll at least you have more cooling air than you need.
right.
So if you can dampen that down, you'll get more like the net amount of airflow going through the main stack is more of it's going to come from the drum. Right now the drum is being choked of air because the cooling fan is taking over
Okay.
the merged stack.
So best case scenario is two separate stacks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Now, what I was going to say is, would a secondary fan, like
Yes.
sort of constant
It,
cooling,
it would help, but you're still going to have this problem of the cooling fan might be dominating so much that you might have to have a ridiculous amount of extra air to actually get enough airflow from the drum. So look, some of them have a damper.
I'll check. I
So
don't remember.
okay, and it should be like on the bottom right side of the machine, I think. But so that's like number one. That would help a lot because you probably could dampen it down like 40% and still have plenty of cooling air.
Okay.
So that might be enough to
Yeah.
to shift the balance. Yeah.
Perfect. That
So-
I knew there was. I knew
Yeah.
it was like stack related, and
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know exactly what the process was.
Yeah, having two stacks is always
Always.
yeah. I've gotten to a
But
point
it's
where
like 25 feet of stack, and the guy
Yeah.
who's paying for it, it's like that's a lot of stack.
yeah, fair enough.
I gotta figure it out, but
Yep.
we'll work it
Awesome.
out. Thanks, man.
Okay, sure. Hey,
What's your opinion on Mill City roasters?
I try not to get in those discussions, but I will say that I have a partner who has one, and we've had a lot of problems.
Oh, really?
Like I used to be really happy with them because they were like following advice, and they were
Yeah.
giving more and more features every year, and they were improving things, and then like they grew so much that their service has gone down a
Because I
lot.
had I don't know, I think David Yardley, you work with David Yardley, right, from Moongoat?
Okay, I don't know.
No, okay. Well,
I know him, but I don't work with him.
yeah, I got a 500 gram Mill
Yeah.
City, and I find it to be very crashy for
Uh,
some reason. I don't know if it's just my.
I've used 12 of those, and I don't have a problem with crashing on them.
Oh, really?
So you could send me, in the group, in the forum, you could send me a curve from your
Okay.
500 gram. We can start talking about it. You could be using too much airflow. That could
Okay.
that could make the crashing happen. Do you know your drum RPM on that?
I was doing it at 66.
That's pretty reasonable. Yeah. So that's not a problem anyway.
I was thinking it might have been airflow because like the way the vent is set up,
Yeah.
it kind of blows chaff out.
Okay.
So I think it might have been too high.
Okay.
So
Okay. So definitely start with airflow.
okay.
See what happens.
Good to know. Me right after I signed up.
It's a good question.
Yeah. Transient.
A little bit. Yeah. My parents live near here, so I'm down here a lot.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Right on.
So.
So you still own shops and stuff like that, or?
No, I've got a couple of partnerships in co-roasting spaces.
Be able to ask you to sign this after the class.
Okay, sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.
Did you bring any of your books with you?
I did not.
But they have some.
They sell a couple here. Yeah. Which book were you looking for?
Probably the Roaster's Guide.
Let me see. I think it's in the other room.
That's what I'm saying is like you in the front.
You, the guy with the hat behind the counter. Will you tell him and he'll take care of you?
Yeah,
All right.
cool.
Awesome.
I will.
Thank
Thank you. I bought the litmus.
Oh, good.
I'm Jesse with the Lost Bean.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
was wondering
good to
when
meet
you
you.
were going to come by.
I almost came by a few days ago, and then
Really?
I got a little busy. But
Oh,
yeah,
that's okay.
I'll get in touch.
I know with the holiday season and whatnot. Just
Yeah.
anytime you're out this way, maybe we can figure something out.
Definitely.
That'd be awesome. Cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good to meet you. Hi.
Glad to be in the class.
What's your name?
Eddie.
Eddie. Good to meet you.
So I never received the online class
Okay.
login.
So if you just ask to join the Facebook group, it's called All Levels Roasting with Scott Rayo, and then I'll just approve you, and then you can see the online class and all that.
So all your PowerPoint and all that. is
Yes.
on there as well?
Yes. Yes. Oh, the PowerPoint. Send me an email and I'll send you the PowerPoint because I send out an email, but could be.
I got into the group on the Facebook.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, so-
You just didn't get the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So just email me scott@scottrayo.com and I'll send you the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry you didn't get that.
No, no
but-
worries.
Okay.
What's this thing doing?
Sorry about that.
I'm gonna start. Hey folks, we're gonna start back up. We're gonna come back in and get going again. Okay.
Oh, really?
Hey, we're gonna start back up again. Okay. Thank you. If you notice any questions up there worth repeating, will you mention them to me? Yeah. Yeah, because we haven't been monitoring those. I wasn't intending on having the home people ask questions, but if you see something appropriate, I'm happy to do it.
Mine's next time to stock up on books.
I'll ask him for
Campbell, you check the battery.
Yeah.
You're better at it than I am.
46?
Okay,
Should be fine.
fantastic. All right, my phone has 46% battery remaining, so that's how long the class is going to go. I'll hope for the best. Ever since Apple changed that whole thing where the charging port is the same as the audio port, and yeah, need to buy one of those little docks, I guess. But okay. So we were talking about roast consistency, using the between batch protocol, warm procedure, et cetera, to create curves that trace each other. Okay, so this is in my head. This is what was happening before roasting software came around, and perhaps for a while afterward. I think of this as the unmanaged roast. I think that probably almost everything I ever tasted in the 80s and early 90s looked something like this, where if you just say like leave one gas setting for a long time, or if you make one of many errors like too low RPM or using too much gas, etc., not enough airflow, you end up with look, the first half of a roast always looks pretty good, right? Like everything's kind of chugging along. You think, okay, this is going great. Suddenly you're getting your first crack. We all know there's a risk that the ROR stops going down. Sometimes it goes up a bit, and then if it does, it'll crash as well. And then, God forbid, you've crashed. Now you're going to flick. So it's like you have this trifecta of a little bit of a hump, a crash, and a flick. I kind of think that was probably the norm for 99% of roasts prior to people using Cropster and Artisan for several years and starting to get the hang of how to control roast curves. So I see this as the unmanaged roast. Like, for instance, if you just decide you're just going to sit on one gas setting for almost an entire roast, this will happen. Okay, like there's a lot of old machines, especially some larger industrial machines, that literally have 2 gas settings, on and off. There's a couple that I've used that had 3 gas settings, high, low, and off. Okay, and with machines like that, it's almost impossible to avoid something like this. Okay, so this to me is like the neglectful roast, right? If you just don't change anything, this is what beans want to do, basically. This will cause roastiness, the crash will cause bakiness, the flick will cause a little more roastiness. Like, not a good thing. So from here on out, we're going to look at curves. We're going to dissect them a bit. We'll talk about some strategies for managing them. Somebody mentioned the soak earlier. The idea of the soak is, it's broad. It's simply the idea of charging with some lower gas setting and then raising the gas setting early in the roast. So a typical soak might be something like using 20 or 25% gas or something like that for a minute, maybe even 2 minutes, and then raising the gas. There's no formula for the soak. The things I would say about the soak are, the soak is probably more effective on smaller machines. That's something that I had an interesting conversation with Steve from Mill City once, and that kind of came out of it. Was like, I was gravitating that way, and he also felt that way, and we had a long talk about it, and it was like, all right, this made sense, and so far since then, experience has kind of told me that's a reasonable place to be. What's a small machine? What's a big machine? I think, something like if you're using a 12 kilo machine or smaller, soaking is pretty reasonable. Once you get 15 kilo and above, I don't think soaking is really going to help you. And this comes back a little bit to the thing we talked about earlier, where larger machines are more thermally stable. So I see the soak as potentially good in one of 2 ways. There's machine management. So sort of like with the really small machines, we talked about how the thermal energy can change rapidly. Soaking can help mitigate the rise in thermal energy that's going to happen later in a roast. It'll kind of delay it and hopefully make it not go quite as hot. And then there's also bean management, right? So beans don't really release any moisture for the first minute or 2 of a roast, depending on how fast you're roasting, because there's a tiny bit of evaporation in the first minute, perhaps, but until some of the bean surface reaches boiling temperature and starts to create steam, you're not really going to lose appreciable moisture. So because there isn't moisture coming out of the bean, it's easier for heat to penetrate the bean. So that means that if you wanted to, you don't necessarily need as much gas the first minute or minute and a half of a roast in order to create a certain rate of heat penetration into the bean. Now, I'm not here to tell you what the right rate is. I don't necessarily know. I'm just saying, like, as a concept, it makes sense to be able to soak in order to control the rate of heat passing into the bean. On really large machines, I don't think the soak is going to matter as much. The machine's pretty solid, pretty stable. I think, at least in my experience, it hasn't made a hell of a lot of difference to soak on a larger machine. I will say in a situation like your Diedrich or some other machines, you might soak as a secondary means of helping to cool the machine a bit if you don't want to wait too long between batches because the machine is stubborn about releasing heat. So, any questions about soaking? Yes, Cam?
There's an online question. When is the best time to start adjusting gas?
Well, I mean, if you soak, you're looking at something like leaving the gas low for, say, a minute or a minute and a half and then raising the gas. Whether you soak or not, I would say the first gas drop, it would be typical to drop the gas somewhere around 300 Fahrenheit, about 150 Celsius, as a reasonable place to begin dropping it. A lot of people might notice, depending on your probe in your machine, you might notice that somewhere around 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 Celsius, you get a little bit of a hump in your ROR. In your ROR. So this one doesn't quite have that. That's not really what I'm talking about. It would be a little more pronounced than that. It seems like there's a bit of a shift in how much moisture is being released from the beans, somewhere around that temperature, and it would probably be a reasonable time to lower the gas in order to chop that hump to keep the ROR steadier. Basically, when less moisture is coming out, the bean surface is going to get hotter faster. So that's probably what's happening. Is you get that little hump because there's a little bit of a temporary decrease in the amount of moisture coming out due to whatever phase the coffee is going through at that point. You can succeed certainly changing the gas at all different times, but I think if you were looking for a template, I would say something like soak on small machines, don't soak on large machines. On all machines, start dropping the gas somewhere around 300 Fahrenheit or 150 Celsius, and then somewhere around 45 seconds before first crack, stop dropping the gas. That's like a pretty good template, which I think is pretty much what this curve is going to talk about. A while back, I did my first kind of beginner's class, and I realized that people didn't necessarily even know a concept like, should you lower the gas while you're roasting? Or should you raise the gas while you're roasting? Like, I've seen people just raise the gas as they go, which creates some really interesting curves. So I realized, so what would be like the most average set of settings I could possibly offer? And I came up with this. This was sort of like, if I just mushed thousands of curves into a computer and said, what were all the settings, it would look something like this. So this is on a relatively small machine where they soaked at 25%. Maybe this is like a 2/3 capacity batch, maybe like an 8 kilo batch and a 12 kilo machine with a reasonable power. And it would look something like this, just, somewhere around 300, maybe a little bit after that. We're dropping the gas for the first time and then staging it down. And then we get to this interesting phase around first crack. So remember the unmanaged roast? Maybe somewhere about a minute before first crack began, there's this tendency for the ROR to want to stop going down. So I think what's going on there is that the beans are releasing far less moisture at that point, maybe even no moisture. And because of that, it loses that little heat shield, that little shield of cooler moisture that's coming out, cooling the surface of the bean, and also creating a little bit of a barrier for the heat. I know that moisture will conduct heat a little more efficiently than if the moisture isn't there, so you might think, well, this sounds really backwards. But I think what's going on, and I'll try to prove it later on, is that the moisture coming out actually deflects the heat a little bit. So some of the heat actually never gets to touch the bean because of the deflection. Bear with me on that for a moment. But because of this dynamic, you end up with the ROR wanting to go up. And then the tremendous amount of moisture being released somewhere around first crack is probably the cause of the crash, in the sense that now you have this huge shift in the amount of moisture coming out. So less moisture, the ROR wants to go up. A lot more moisture, the ROR goes down. And then as first crack subsides, and as there's not as much moisture coming out, then potentially you have the flick. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so the idea here, if you want like the simplest version of good settings, is that somewhere around about 45 seconds before first crack, you drop the gas, so maybe from 40 to 30, and then you're not touching the gas again until well after first crack, and in fact until about 11-12% ETR. And the reason for this is that you want to drop the gas to make sure the ROR is not going to go level. But once you're about to hit first crack, you don't want to lower the gas again, because at this point, you can only make the crash worse if the crash happens, right? In the second half of that blue zone, your only real risk is a crash for most coffees, okay? So you want, paradoxically, you want less moisture in this phase because you want to keep the ROR going down. Less gas in this phase, but you don't want to lower the gas excessively for this part because then if there's a crash, you might make it worse. Okay, just in case this is on anyone's mind, it's not a great idea to simply raise the gas the moment before a crash because although that might make your curve look better, it tends to make coffee taste rather roasty, especially in the drum roaster. So we need a more sophisticated strategy to keep the ROR steady. So does that make sense? Hope I didn't rush. Yeah, sure. So some people just simply, their ROR is kind of chugging down, and then they know a crash is about to happen, and they just jack up the gas. Okay, so it'll cosmetically make the curve look better, but it tends to make coffee taste rougher, roastier. Okay, so in a sense, for most coffees, if you can sort of set yourself on the right path with the right angle and the right amount of gas, and I have no idea what that is for you, conceivably you can ride that one gas setting all the way to about 11, 12% DTR, keep your ROR steadily dropping, and then that's the easiest way to achieve a smooth ROR. There's going to be coffees that don't cooperate. There's going to be coffees that are going to crash no matter what, and you need a different strategy for that, which we can talk about at the very end. Okay. So this is a relatively new concept that I came up with about a year ago that it works really, really well for almost every coffee. And the idea is this. Early and first crack for most coffees, an exception would be Ethiopians of the last 2 years. Like if you've roasted in Ethiopia in the last couple of years, you might have noticed that the ROR tends to stay flat and not crash. And then somewhere later in first crack, it crashes really late compared to most other coffees. So we'll consider that an exception. But for most coffees, this pattern will be very true. So early and first crack, really the thing you got to worry about is a crash. You don't really have to worry about anything else. The ROR is not going to take off on you early and first crack. All right. So you want to make sure that you're not dropping the gas prematurely during this phase because if there is a crash, lowering the gas will make it worse. Okay. But late in first crack, when first crack slows down and less moisture is coming out, now the risk has shifted. You have no risk of a crash at this point, but you have a huge risk of a flick coming if you don't lower the gas enough. Does that make sense? So you have to shift your focus like, okay, I'm worried about a crash until this point, and now I'm worried about a flick. Okay? The flick on a normal situation where you're not roasting like incredibly hot and incredibly fast and incredibly dark, your flick will almost always occur between 16 and 17% DTR. So knowing that allows you to proactively lower the gas ahead so that the flick will never happen. This is what I was talking about earlier about preventing flicks, right? So I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to come back. There's this trick that I came up with about 9 months ago where, every time you drop the gas, you see the ETRR kind of go down and come back up, come down, come back up. And then you notice there's that one crater that's just far bigger than the rest, right? You won't see this on every coffee. You won't see it on every machine. But if you're lucky enough to see this in your curves, you can assume that that is first crack. When you get that big crater, that starts to come back up. Now, if you can mark it based on that, you have a pretty objective indicator of when first crack began. Whether somebody else wants to mark it at a different point in first crack is besides the point. The point is you have a consistent marker, and it's yours. Okay? If you use that marker successfully, and you trust me on this concept, if you start lowering your gas at 12%, so let's say you're using 20% gas going into first crack. You've marked the first crack with that ET-ROR dip, right? Drop your gas in half to about 10 at 12% DTR. Drop it in half again to 5% at about 14% DTR. Drop it in half again to say 2% at 16% DTR. A pattern almost identical to that on most machines will allow you to roast steadily dropping ROR without stalling and then without flicking. That'll get you as far as you can go without a crash or a flick or a stall. Okay. Now, if you don't know when first crack is, it gets trickier to manage your gas after first crack. If you can't hear first crack or you can't see it on the curve, right? Some coffees like the Ethiopians in the last couple of years are going to defy a lot of this, and I basically just treat them like, I treat the crash a little bit like I treat most coffees first crack. In other words, I forget where first crack is, and I just kind of see where the crash is, and then kind of use that as my marker to decide how to change my gas after that, or before and after that. Yeah.
So I've noticed that happens on my machine, and it's a good 20 seconds before I can hear anything going on.
Yeah, yeah. So, you're talking about the ETRR
That
crater?
Yeah.
So, what's important is this. Like, I don't want to argue with someone about whether you should mark first crack like upon the first audible crack or once it's a rolling crack. Like, that's not the point. The point is, if you have this, you have consistency. and then you have a system you can work with, right? So I don't know when the right time the mark first crack is, but I do know that if you have this, that you can predict exactly when to change the gas later on, and it's so easy. Yeah.
Is it true that you can see your ET before your BT on your profile?
Well, generally speaking, if you look at this curve, the ET ROR is extremely sensitive compared to everything else on that graph. So that's your canary in the coal mine. That's your early indicator. Yeah. So, yeah. And every time you change the gas, like you've affected the ETR a lot because the air temperature passing past that probe is affected a lot by how high the burner is at any given moment. So you get these kind of ups and downs. But so anyway, remember earlier I said that I believe the moisture is deflecting the heat, so it can't get in. If you notice that around the time of the crash, right, and first crack, that's also the time that the ET tends to go up, right? Like the ETROR is going up a lot, right? So it's weird, right? Like why would the bean surfaces be getting cooler and a lot of moisture coming out, but also the ET is going up? Why would those two diverge like that? And the only thing I could ever come up with is that the extra moisture coming out is actually deflecting some of the heat trying to get to the beans. And I think it's pretty credible. And even if it's not the exact right answer, it's a working model that it works in real life in terms of being able to figure out what to do with the coffee. But regardless of that, whether it's true or not, this system has been great as far as marking first crack and knowing exactly when to change the gas after first crack. Like it's become 90% of coffees, it's like clockwork. Yeah. The only, if you're roasting into second crack or you're roasting really dark, you need a slightly different strategy because, with my system of dropping a gas like that, like you can keep the ROR steady, but the ROR won't take forever to go to zero. It's going to eventually zero out, right? So you might need a significantly higher amount of gas to get much darker. Anybody here roast into second crack? I mean, yeah, okay. So if you have to do that, you need more gas, of course, right? Because you need to sustain the ROR more through first crack. Now, if you use so much gas that the ROR kind of does this, it's probably going to crash, which is really bad, right? There's a little bit of a paradoxical thing that I learned on one of those jobs where I was like so, uncomfortable with how dark this person wanted to roast, but I got to learn something new from it, which was great. And that was that, if you use the right amount of gas and you do this, great. If you use too much gas, this happens, bad, right? If you use even more gas, like overwhelm it with gas, right, you can actually just skip the whole crash. The ROR just levitates past the crash. So let's say 20% is the right amount to go to a light roast and keep it steady. And let's say 35% gives you that, right? Maybe 50% gas just cruises you right past the crash. It's really interesting.
Yeah, then you feel like you got a runaway train.
You do. But, you have choices, right? Do you want to crash in a flick or do you want just like a really hard roast to time the ending? Yeah, I'd choose number 2. Yeah. So, all right. Yes, any questions? Okay. Did I skip something here? No, that's that. Okay, so this is what it looks like graphically if you were dropping your gas, let's say, in half at 12%, 14%, 16% DTR. Those percentages are averages. Some machines you might not drop it quite half. Depends on your valve and how your machine is reading gas settings, but that's a pretty good place to start. Okay. Okay, so we went over that. So this combination, this is the same curve. It's just that the BT ROR shifts when you turn on the ET ROR, right? But you can see that the person who roasted this chose 391.6 as first crack, and it looks like that might be where first crack is because of where the crash is, but in fact the ET ROR trick would say no, it was significantly earlier. And again, it's not that one is right or one is wrong. It's just more like if you can see this, use it because it gives you consistency and repeatability. Okay. So we've touched upon parts of this, right? When we talked about the soak, when we talked about gas around first crack, I think of the roast. I think the most important concept to understand and be able to predict how to use gas during roasting is to know how much moisture is being released by the beans and when, right? So we talked about how for the first minute, perhaps minute and a half, there's very little moisture coming out because the coffee hasn't reached a steaming temperature, so the water isn't boiling off yet. Then once the surface of the bean and then deeper layers start to create steam, now you've got much higher release of moisture. So you have very low release of moisture, then a really high release of moisture, and then somewhere, call it 45, 50 seconds before first crack begins, the release of moisture starts to slow down quite a bit. And then when first crack happens, there's a really concentrated release of moisture, quite high. And then as first crack is ending, the release of moisture goes down again. So this kind of informs how much gas to use, right? The low moisture release in the beginning says you don't necessarily need a lot of gas in the beginning. The high moisture release here says you need a lot of gas to overcome that moisture and the deflection of heat. Then as you approach first crack, you don't need much gas. The paradoxical part is here. We know that if you just jack up the gas right before the crash, which is usually right around first crack's beginning, that it'll keep the curve steady, but it may not make the coffee taste good. So this graph says use a lot of gas there. I'm saying use as much as you can, but don't raise the gas to do it. So you want to use like the right amount to get you, kind of cruising through the phase, where the RWAR wants to go up, but where you don't allow it to go up, and just enough gas to prevent a crash. Now, and then where it says end of first crack, like before then is when you have to start lowering the gas so that you don't flick. Okay, so there's a concept called the dip. Now this is pretty advanced, and I actually don't want to get too deep into it in this class because I think even with people I work with on a one-on-one basis, like people like to abuse the dip, and it's really hard to do well. Okay, so the idea behind the dip though is that while you don't want to just simply like you getting to a crash, you say, oh, I'm going to jack up the gas to prevent a crash. You don't want to do that, but you can raise the gas if you precede it with a much lower gas setting for a little while without a side effect. So in other words, when you're going through this phase of low moisture release right before first crack, if you lower the gas a lot to kind of match that phase because you don't need much gas through it, it sort of becomes okay to raise the gas. Because if you're using a drum roaster, you've cooled the drum surface quite a bit, you've kept your ROR ticking down steadily, and now the extra gas isn't going to create the flavor taint. Timing that is extremely difficult, and getting the magnitude of the gas right might take a little practice, but it can be incredibly powerful. If you have a coffee that just crashes hard no matter what you do, the dip is your answer. You have nothing to lose if you try the dip with those coffees. All right. If you have a coffee that just crashes slightly, don't do the dip, because the dip you're going to miss sometimes. The dip is hard. Just live with a slight crash. But if you have something that's just crashing no matter what you do, you try the dip. So here's an example. This coffee, the first time we roasted the coffee, we got this curve, and it went kind of flat and then crashed. And we said, OK, let's try the dip on this. So this was actually, with this client, this is the first time he ever dipped. So this was great. It was a great example. So you can see that we lowered the gas in a sort of classic pattern, the darker orange curve. Hopefully you can see the pale curve behind it on the gas graph. This is what we got with the dip. So the very next batch, it went from this to this, which was a significant improvement both in terms of the curve and the cup quality. So I'll go back one screen in a moment, but I think of this a little bit like Tetris, how like you're just moving the blocks around, right? We have the same total amount of gas. We just displaced where we used it. Okay, so if you can see it like this, like these are the two different gas graphs, right? Like the blue one is the dip, the orange one is the non-dip. They both used almost the same amount of gas, but we just kind of spread it out so that there's that phase where we cut the gas a lot, but before that phase, we didn't lower the gas as much as usual. And then after the dip, of course, we're a lot higher than usual. Does that make sense? Okay, so the general pattern is see when the crash happened. Let's say your crash happened at 390 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, what was the bean temperature 45 seconds before that crash? You go back and you say, okay, it was 380 or whatever. Now that becomes the dip temperature. So then the next time you roast the coffee, when you get to 380, that's where you dip. You dip when you think you're 45 seconds before the crash. A good template is to dip for 20 seconds to about half of the gas setting you were using before the dip, and then you undip, you go back to the original gas setting. So this is just a template. Things not to do, please don't raise the gas higher than the pre-dip setting. In other words, if you were at 40 and you dip to 20, don't go then back up to 50. That's just, it makes no sense. You might as well have been at 45, 20, 45. Like, don't go higher than the 40. Just trust me on that. I don't want to get into it. It's just like people all the time want to change the dip and it just doesn't work. And then they spend months and months bastardizing the dip and they come back and then they eventually just go back to this and it really works. It's just a matter of getting the timing right. So a little warning though, if you don't trace curves well, you will never know when to dip. If your curves are off by a little bit, the dip will move. The dip is very sensitive to your ET curve and how that's affecting your bean temperature reading, et cetera. Like, you've got to be tracing curves well before you do the dip. Okay, so this is super advanced. This is really hard to execute. Again, save it for coffees that are just failing. If you're like, I can't stop this coffee from crashing, try the dip. And on those Ethiopians that crash really late, don't be afraid to dip after first crack. Took me a long time to do that. I just thought it must be wrong for a long time, and then one day I did it, and I was like, oh, that was fine. Just look at the curve. Just, if you're crashing over here, dip 45 seconds before that crash, wherever the crash happens to be. Okay.
And then the after would be 45 seconds after first crack?
No, so forget about first crack.
Okay.
First crack doesn't matter here. The crash matters.
The crack.
You're dipping roughly 45 seconds before the crash. You dip for 20 seconds.
Yeah, no, with the
Cool.
Ethiopian.
Oh,
Same thing.
well, whenever it happens.
Okay.
Yeah, just forget first crack, right? The only interesting thing that happens is that because you're roasting at a higher gas setting and roasting pretty fast coming out of the dip, you actually have to drop the gas earlier than 12% DTR, usually about 9% DTR, with at least the way I've been dipping it, because you actually have so much momentum, and also your software is never quite keeping up with you. Like, you're always looking with a little bit of a lag. So if you're roasting a lot faster, there's more lag in a sense. But point is, that's not what's important. The point is, drop the gas at a lower DTR than usual if you're dipping. Yeah. So, Josh?
Some people don't have the dip on their slide.
That's true. That was, yeah. It was a last minute thing that I decided to put in because I wasn't sure if we'd get to it or not because it's super advanced. If someone really wants that slide, they can email me, and I'll send it to them. Okay. Okay. Are they okay with that? Okay. I know people are already upset about the 3 video thing. I'm just, I don't want to upset anybody any further. Okay. So just to wrap up a few things, this is what I think of as best practices to make your life a lot easier. Roasting consistent green temperature, using a warm up and BBP that help you replicate curves, not using too much coffee at once, choosing one batch size, one charge temperature, reasonable temperature, and just kind of sticking with that. Generally, you're always lowering the gas unless you're soaking or dipping. Yeah, and then the things we just talked about. So that's probably everything I have planned to say. So if you have questions, concerns, whether it was something in the presentation or not, let me know. Or Josh, tell me if anybody's typing any questions. Elliot?
If we're removing, or say we're not going to do the soak anymore,
Yep.
would your first initial gas setting probably be the same as what you were going to?
I mean, I think if you soak, you might use a slightly higher peak gas setting than if you don't soak. So if you soak, say, at 20%, you move up to 90. Without soaking, maybe you're at 80, something like that. Yeah. But I should say, I didn't say this before, but I should say that if you have a system where you have your BBP and you have your charge temperature relative to batch size, like your initial gas setting might be influenced very much by the coffee. But really what I'm looking for is if I'm sitting on a gas setting, like say 80%, all the way until bean temperature 300 or 150 C, I'm judging that really based on how long was the roast. If I'm getting an 11-minute roast and that's my target, then I feel like I've succeeded in, like, the first half of the roast, I'm not going to mess with that ever again, right? I've got my charge temperature, I've got my BBP, I've got my 80% gas until 300. Like, if I had an 11-minute roast and that was my goal, all of that worked out great. At that point, if I'm not happy with the coffee or development or whatever, I will only mess with the second half of the roast because it's too many moving parts. If you start messing with the first gas setting, the early peak gas setting, I should say, like, now everything else has to change, which sometimes you have to do. But if your time is pretty good and everything's pretty reasonable, just stick with that and then just mess with the later parts of the roast.
Just more going from, since we have 2 machines now, soak on a larger machine or not?
Well, you have a 12 and you have a 22. I mean, I would say it's reasonable to soak on your 12. I don't think there's much reason to soak on the 22.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah.
As far as doing techniques for certain coffees, we pretty much soak on all of our coffees, and then we only dip on like Kenyan and a few other
The big crashers.
big crashes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there should we soak on some and not others, or is there any kind of formula behind that, or just?
I mean, look, you've got a 15-kilo machine. You're at that line where it's like soaking's very optional. So I think whichever you choose is fine. I think stick with one and just master that system. Because switching back and forth between soaking and not soaking is a little tricky.
Yeah.
But I think you've got the right idea. Like the hard crashers, try the dip. If you got a coffee that's not crashing hard, just be happy with it. Don't mess with the dip because the dip is kind of high risk, high reward. Yes, Cam.
Question from online. How about electrical machines? could you manage the ROR increasing the airflow instead of lowering the gas?
Okay, so the question is, with electric machines, how do you manage airflow and airflow and ROR? I don't have a lot of experience with electric machines. The few that I've used, I find that much like indirectly fired machines, where the burner is kind of separate from the drum, generally speaking, I'm looking at progressively lowering the gas and progressively increasing the airflow, like stair step together, more or less. With electric machines, most of them, the burners, are really slow to respond when you lower the setting. There's more latency. Is that the right word? Like they'll stay hotter longer. Like with a gas stove, you turn down, it's cooler. With electric stove, you turn down, it's like it'll be cooler soon, right? So you have to plan ahead really well. And generally speaking, I'm increasing the airflow because I have to sort of like there's a lot of trapped heat with the electric machine that you have to disperse in a sense. But I'm definitely not an expert in electric roasting. So yes.
When you're stepping your gas and your airflow, are you using airflow stepping first before gas, or gas before air? Or?
Okay, so just in case anybody can't hear it, when you're stepping up and down your gas and airflow, which one are you doing first, or how are you using them? Generally speaking, I would say, I'm assuming you're lowering your gas, right? Lower, lower, lower. If you're going to raise the airflow, which I imagine you're doing, if you're going to do it, lower the gas first, wait a couple seconds, and then raise the airflow. Because if you raise the airflow, what happens is you get a little turbo boost, right? Like you get a little push, probably because you're stripping some heat off of the drum and some surfaces of the machine, right? So, and you're also shoving the hot air from the higher burner setting, you're shoving it through a little bit faster, right? You're spending it earlier, but you get that little bump. But if you lower the gas, wait a couple seconds, and then increase the airflow, you won't get as much of a bump. The system will stay a little smoother.
Okay.
Yeah, I never change the airflow without dropping the gas just before the airflow change. Yeah.
And then when you're about to go into a crash, sometimes I'll raise the airflow just to kind of settle that out a little bit.
Okay, so so the question is, he's going into a crash, sometimes he raises the airflow to mitigate the crash. I actually think it's backwards. Although I don't like lowering the airflow late in the roast because you might trap smoke in, you'll find that, and you can do this one day if you just feel like experimenting.
No, raising the airflow.
So I understand,
Okay.
but raising the airflow usually makes crashing worse. But if you have the guts to do it one day, cut the airflow a lot as you're about to crash and see what happens. It won't crash nearly as much. Now, I'm not saying that's good because you need a certain amount of airflow to be exhausting the smoke and the chaff effectively, but raising the airflow is probably not a good idea as a way of preventing crashing. So the only time I ever increase airflow late in a roast is only very late in a roast after 16% DTR when I'm worried about a flick and my gas is already at 0 or very close to 0. Like my gas is like 0, 1% or pilot or something like that, and you raise the airflow, you're not going to get the acceleration. But if your gas is, say, 10% and you're worried about a flick or something, and if you raise the gas, you're going to flick more. But if you've already virtually taken the heat out of the burner system and then you increase the airflow, you'll actually hold down a flick. Yeah. Yes?
So how late in the roast do you change your airflow?
How late in the roast? Okay. Question is, how late in the roast do you change your airflow? I would say if I had to give a rule of thumb, don't raise it anytime later than 2 minutes before first crack. That's just a ballpark idea. But just like that unmanaged roast, if you decide to raise your airflow pretty close to first crack, you're going to get that little acceleration, and it's quite possible you're going to get that hump, and it's going to be very bad timing because then you'll get a crash. You'll make the crash worse if you do that.
And you would say like have your airflow fully open by that point, 15 minutes before first crack?
Yeah, so your highest airflow setting should definitely be achieved at least 2 minutes before first crack, and then just be happy with it. Just leave it. Now, look, you could change your airflow 20 times a roast. You could change your airflow late. There's a lot of things you could do, and you could figure out a system to make it work. I'm very much focused on what is going to give you the highest odds of success without overly complicating your system. Because I've had clients who had really complicated systems, and sometimes it works, but they have an incredibly difficult time repeating roasts and not running into problems because they're making so many changes. But I think these are sound principles for just simplifying your life so that you get pretty good curves and pretty good consistency as often as possible. So but not to say you can't increase airflow later. I just think it's the risk reward is skewed way in favor of risk. So, yeah.
How do you determine when to drop? Assuming everything goes well, when do you drop, and what happens if it stalls or flicks?
Okay, so the question is, how do you know when to drop a coffee, and what do you do if it stalls and flicks? I have no idea when you should drop a coffee. That's completely up to you. I've got clients who roast like super light Nordic. I've got clients who roast a second crack. I have my preferences, but that's not my job. So I think, that's like the one place where personal preference becomes pretty dominant is, every company's got their target flavor profiles and their customer base, and I don't get involved in how dark they roast. An interesting thing that happens is if you're getting a stall and you're not done, like if the roast isn't finished color-wise, like what do you do? And that's a hard one because either you just take it out of the machine and hope that it was developed enough and you're happy with it, or you leave it in and you force a flick, which you know is going to add some roastiness, but maybe you need it in order to not be underdeveloped. And it depends on the situation, but the answer is I don't know. Like that's, the best answer is don't let it ever happen. But if it happens, there's no easy answer. I tend to err on the side of I'll just drop it and hope the development was good enough. But you have to use your judgment each time. Yeah. Yes?
Is there any good reason to soak with no heat and closed airflow for the first minute, or is it more recommended to do something like a 20% flame and a little bit of airflow?
Right. So the question is there a reason to soak with no gas and to choke the airflow completely for a minute or two, something like that? You could. I mean, the Diedrich system is sort of like that, the one they recommend where the cooling bin is getting most of the air in the first couple minutes of a roast. I don't think there's a flavor taint associated with it. I don't think there's a problem with it. And I also think, though, that things you do extremely early in a roast are harder to identify in the cup, right? Like if you have a little flick at the end of a roast, you can almost always sense it in the cup. Like things that happen at the end of a roast are somehow more present. Things that happen at the very beginning are very hard to sort through because all these other things happen afterward, right? So, I think it's a bit of a weird system to purposefully choke off the airflow. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. I think I would only do it either in situations where I know I'm putting far too much coffee in a machine and the machine isn't powerful enough, therefore I'm trapping in heat to get up to reasonable roasting temperatures, or it's really like the same thing again, or I'm just using a very underpowered machine that just always needs trapping of heat. And that's really, the Diedrich system came about because, in my mind, because years and years ago, they made their machines with incredibly small burners. So I once saw an 18 kilo Diedrich on a job that had 45,000 BTUs. Now, by my standards, that's 9 pounds of capacity. And yet the machine was designed for 40 pounds of capacity. And the thing was, back then they were recommending 35, 40-minute roasts. This is a long time ago. Okay, so, and over the years they put on more and more powerful burners and bigger fans, but the system of cooling bin 50-50 roasting drum never really changed. And I'm not going to say the system doesn't work, but I'm just going to say I think that the reason the system existed was to compensate for the really early machines that were very underpowered, and then no one really had the presence of mind to say, oh, that system isn't necessary anymore now that we have more powerful burners and et cetera. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. Okay. And you can mimic this problem by just stuffing your machine with too much coffee. Then you might want to choke the airflow to do the same thing, but don't do it. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a rate of rise range that you look for when you're charging a batch, or do you try to be consistent with your numbers? Say in my experience, my rate of rise is at 30 intervals, and it's usually at 60 before I charge. It's booking it. It's
okay.
Really fast.
So the question is, before you charge, are you looking at a certain ROR?
Yeah.
Okay. So in your case, you're charging with the temperature going up.
Yeah.
Someone else might be coming down. I don't really look at it like that, but I would say I wouldn't want to be rising too fast, because if you're moving too fast between batches, your air temperature can change radically in a couple of seconds, right? It has almost no mass, but the metal temperature is going to be struggling to keep up, right? It's going to go really slowly. So if you do things really quickly between batches, I don't think you really have any idea what the metal's doing. So I think you have to go to kind of a snail's pace between batches to have a sense of what the metal temperature is. So I don't think you want to be charging with your ROR just rocketing up, because it's just a little bit of an illusion. Like the air temperature is getting a lot hotter, but the metal isn't moving nearly as fast. But hey, again, if you can make it work where your curves trace and you're happy with the results, then it's working for you. Again, though, it's just I'm trying to come up with systems that make success easier, right? And some people love the challenge, or some people love the more complicated systems, and I'm just a huge fan of what can I do to make roasting easier? I always say there's no points for difficulty, right? Just make it easier on yourself when you can, Duffy?
Stock decaf.
Stock decaf.
Yeah.
Vice.
Does the soak, could that help get better development in decaf without burning the crap out of it at the end?
The question is, can the soak help development of decaf? The answer is, I mean, the soak, when it's appropriate, I think it can be relatively good for development. I don't think it has anything to do with decaf. I think decaf's incredibly easy to develop.
Okay.
It's also
incredibly easy to push too far and get really roasty and nasty.
sure. I mean, decaf, because of the process it's been through, the cellulose is weaker. And because of the process it's been through, if they've done it well, the moisture is distributed very evenly throughout the beans. It's not going to need as much gas to penetrate, and it's almost never going to crash because of the moisture distribution and weakness of the cellulose, right? Decaf should be really easy to roast, smooth curves, and just use a lot less gas for the decaf. Like that's, I think people may not be adapting well enough. Like they may not be dropping the gas enough to compensate for the fact that decaf just doesn't need that much energy to roast.
I find it pretty easy to err on the side of underdeveloping decaf after, just because it gets the first crack pretty quickly, and then it
Just use less gas.
Okay.
I mean, are you doing decaf first batch of the day?
No.
Okay. How fast are your decaf roasts?
20% less than other roasts.
Yeah, just use less gas. I mean, it really is that simple, I think. Like the roast time shouldn't be that different than other coffees, and you should feel in control of the coffee. Send me a decaf curve. All right. Josh?
Have you determined if you should increase your development versus drop temperature?
Okay, so I assume the question is development time ratio versus drop temperature.
Yeah.
I don't think. Okay, so I'll be clear about one thing. Like, I don't think people should ever be dropping coffee based on DTR. I think that's an abuse of what it is. I think what it should be for is just like a sense of balance in your roast, like that you're not roasting really fast in the beginning and then just really slow at the end, or finishing really fast or anything like that. That you have your roast curve in balance. Really, roast color is going to correlate with flavor 10 times more than DTR is going to correlate with flavor. So I think people should be focusing on color and potentially bean temperature as the proxy for color to decide when to drop a batch. So.
20% battery life.
Okay, thank you. I've been sweating about the battery the whole time. All right. Yes.
So your warm-up procedures had a little note not applicable for Lorings?
Okay, so right, Lorings. The good news is that Lorings are easier, in the sense that you don't have a flame on a drum. The drum on the Loring tends to not get as hot. There tends to be not as much conduction, and the Loring tends to be a little easier to make roast repeat. Okay, so that's really good. So I think your warm-up should be similar on the Loring. Your between batch protocol can probably be a little bit faster and a little simpler, because you're not as desperate in the Loring to cool the drum and make sure that it's back to this kind of constant thermal energy, because it just gets there quicker in the Loring because the drum was never that hot to begin with. And because it's recirculating so much air, it's much more. It's not the machine's more thermally stable. It's just that there's more air in the system that's constantly being recirculated. So the temperatures in the Loring don't kind of go haywire as much when it's empty the way it does in the drum roaster. Yeah. So there are a lot of advantages with the Loring. Yeah. Do you have a Loring? Yeah. Okay. Just checking. Yes, Ed.
With air settings, a maximum air setting at the end of the roast, is there any rule, like our dropper here is on a percentage basis?
Yeah.
So we used to max out at 70, and then we experimented with 80 and 90 and 60. Like, is there a rule of thumb that we should be treating as our maximum air setting?
No, so the question is, is there some maximum air setting that you look for? Of course, like your 90% air is not the same as somebody else's 90% air. Even just changing your stack length or shape, like if you have more bends in your stack, or if your stack gets dirtier, it changes the airflow, right? So even if somebody else has a 15 kilo joper, your 90% and their 90% are different. So that's number one. Number two is I think that you want to use as much airflow as necessary to efficiently get rid of the chaff and the smoke, but not more than that. Because if you use excessive air, you might be more likely to crash, and you might have to use a little bit more gas to compensate for how fast the heat's leaving the machine. And that extra gas makes the drum a little hotter, which is not good. So find the amount of air that you need for your system so that you have just enough to get the job done, but don't use more. And that should be your highest air setting. So One thing I didn't talk about today here, but like what I've done with a lot of my clients and all the machines that I'm personally involved in, we've added an air pressure manometer into the duct between the drum and the fan. And you can't really put an airflow meter there. I mean, you can, but the thing is that the probes get dirty too quickly, is my understanding, and so they won't read accurately after the first couple tries. An air pressure manometer is not the same as airflow, but for a given moment in time, they're correlated. As the stack gets dirtier and its diameter starts to shrink a little bit due to the crud in there, the relationship of pressure and flow starts to shift slightly. But for a given day, or a given, maybe a couple of weeks of time or whatever, there'll be some air pressure reading that will represent some airflow amount, and it'll guide you. So for instance, like we have a Probot P12, and I think, with our, I think he does like 4.5, maybe 6 and 10 kilo batches, something like that. Like he's got like 3 separate pressure readings for the different batch sizes, a little bit more pressure for each one, and he just aims for that every time. So this way, if the weather changes and the airflow is a little different today than it was yesterday, he tweaks the fan slightly, gets back to that pressure, and now he knows it's almost identical to yesterday. And that actually helps us tremendously, because sometimes we see spikes in the air pressure due to weather changes or even due to wind, things like that, and we can adjust for it. And we also see sometimes that when the air pressure, for whatever reason, is changing quickly, that the curves get bumpier too. So all of this data has really helped us to get more consistent and to predict things better. So that's a really good recommendation, because your fan setting is just an input, right? And what 80% fan means today is not what it means in a month when the stack is dirtier. And it's really not what it means after you clean the stack and now the airflow suddenly jumps. But having that air pressure manometer can really help you smooth over that, so that you have a much better sense of what's going on with your airflow over time.
To that point, have you noticed external environmental temps, like roasting in Sedona at 105 degree external temperature? I'm pushing so much air through my fan.
So I mean, generally speaking, drier, cooler air outside will create more lift in the stack. So it'll give you a little more airflow. Whereas you're seeing dry in Sedona. Dry is huge. Like the humidity has a huge impact on this. Hot, moist air will choke your airflow a little bit, because the air doesn't have as much contrast to cause the draw a little bit.
Diameter of exhaust venting and how high it goes up above the building?
Sure. I mean, the higher your stack, the more resistance, more friction you get in the stack, so you're going to get less airflow, all being equal. If you have a 10-story building above you, that's probably a problem where, maybe your fan was overpowered, and maybe you have enough to push through that, but maybe you need a booster fan, et cetera.
It's just the opposite. I've got so little clearance between the roof and the top of the stack that it's probably 125 degrees right there, versus getting above the edge a little bit more, it drops another 10 degrees, but it's just oppressive.
Yeah. Just move. That's all. Okay, maybe we'll just take 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Anybody else here or online want to ask a question?
Do you have any general considerations / adjustments when using a Dietrich?
Okay, so like we talked about earlier, it really depends on which Dietrich you have. So not only are the different models of Dietrich different, like there's the IR burners and the smaller ones, and then there's the open gas flame on the larger Dietrichs, and then what year your IR machine came from will determine how big the burner is and whether it has the heat exchange panels, how big the fan is. So it's really hard to generalize about that. If someone tells me their model year, usually I can give them an estimate of how to use it, but it's a little bit too complex to try to approach it here with a group. I'm sorry.
If you were to distill 2 points for Dietrich equipment for either IR series or non, and
so,
I suppose late model, what were the 2 most important things that you've seen in your experience that made an impact in any category?
Okay, so the question really is, if you could just say 2 points of advice about running a Dietrich, what would you do? I think the important, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think the important point is that a lot of people make a big deal out of the IR burners and act like everything's different. Like I've talked to people at Dietrich and I'll say something about crashing or something else, and they're like, you don't understand because they're IR burners. And I'm like, no, coffee is coffee. Like that roast curve is a better indicator of flavor than anything else, and controlling it is still the critical factor, right? There is no special trick to Dietrichs or Probots or anything else. Like getting relatively smooth RORs, using reasonable settings for your airflow, for your gas pressure, for your drum RPM, like those are the critical factors to setting yourself up for success, right? if you have like we said before, like if you have a really underpowered machine, maybe you use lower airflow in the beginning to trap some heat. If you've got the heat exchange panels, maybe you need some tricks to dissipate heat between batches. So, but you know, the things we've talked about today are that's an adequate plan of attack for a Diedrich or a Probot or a Gießen or anything else. You just have to make sensible modifications of the system for a given machine.
Agreed. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the best I can do.
Sure.
Sorry. Plus, I'm tired, and now I'm going to deal with all the people who are angry that there's 3 different videos. So, you know. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you for coming in person. Thanks for coming online. We have, since you have a ticket to the class, for the next month, there's a forum on that Facebook group. So people are welcome to ask questions about the class, post a curve. We can talk about some roasting data. I'll do my best to give some suggestions. It's almost like a mini, consulting or coaching session. And I'll leave that open for a month. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Okay.
He also had 2 Nico cells. Wait, this guy's